Planet of the Apes is one of the strangest and strongest science fiction franchises of all time. Not just one of the founding visions of modern science fiction on film, but a vision strong enough to survive multiple seeming deaths of the franchise and come back again and again, eventually becoming another acclaimed series in the modern day. But the road there wasn't easy, and some of the franchise's greatest entries have been ignored due to budget cuts and compromises. After Pierre Boulle's 1963 novel, the Planet of the Apes franchise has spanned from 1968 to today, encompassing 10 films and many different spin-offs. In that time, the story of the apes has had an original series of time-looping movies, a disastrous remake, and a modern-day trilogy that's now given life to another series of future-set films. It's at once both a daunting sprawl of ideas and timelines, and a tightly focused series of stories that all offer their own unique philosophical and political perspectives. And what was once a definitively finished story is now a world of endless possibility, becoming the rare film franchise whose modern incarnation stands shoulder to shoulder with the original movies. But what gave life to the planet in the first place? What killed the franchise for decades? And what brought it roaring back to life? Come with me as we explore the future, past, and present of the Planet of the Apes. The saga of Planet of the Apes begins in 1963, with the publication of Pierre Boulle's novel La Planète des Singes in France. At the time of its publication, Boulle had already become a successful author, with his 1952 novel The Bridge on the River Kwai not only a hit, but adapted into a Best Picture winning film in 1957. Boulle's success was so proven that film producer Arthur P. Jacobs purchased the rights to Planet of the Apes before it was even published. But more on that in a minute. Boulle's Apes novel, much like the adaptation, sees a group of astronauts land on a planet after traveling centuries into the future, soon finding that this land is home to primitive humans and highly advanced apes that hunt them. There are plenty of similarities between the book and film versions of Apes, but several key differences mark very different outlooks and ideas on the fate of humanity. There are a lot more sci-fi concepts in Boulle's novel, with the apes living in a technologically advanced society and eventually discovering that humans were once the advanced species and they the primitive ones, by unlocking genetic memory in a human test subject. But most critically is that this planet and Earth really are two different worlds, and not the famous twist that comes to define the film series. At the end, our protagonist Ulysses and his love interest Nova escape on a monkey spaceship and travel back to Earth, only to find that it too has been overtaken by advanced apes. Boulle would afterward deny his novel's categorization as science fiction, and instead see it as a satire. Really, it's both, and the same can be said for the 5 films that followed, which is critical to their unique vision and fearless purpose in critiquing major social issues. Boulle also never thought highly of his own book or the films that followed, saying, "I don't consider it one of my best novels. For me, it was just a pleasant fantasy. I never thought it could be made into a film. It seemed to me too difficult, and there was the chance that it would appear ridiculous. When I first saw the film, nothing was ridiculous because it had been very well made. In comparison to the book, there were a lot of changes made. Some of them were disconcerting. The first part of the film was very good, and the makeup of the apes was particularly good. I disliked somewhat the ending that was used, the Statue of Liberty, which the critics seemed to like, but personally, I prefer my own." With the rights to Planet of the Apes in hand, Arthur P. Jacobs hired Rod Serling of Twilight Zone fame to adapt the book, and Serling went on to write more than 30 drafts in a year. However, every studio that Jacobs approached to finance him rejected the film. A few factors helped convince 20th Century Fox to greenlight it. Jacobs was able to get director Franklin Schaffner and massive star actor Charlton Heston attached to the movie, and did an on-camera makeup test featuring Heston acting opposite Edward G. Robinson in orangutan makeup as Dr. Zaius. The makeup was put together quickly, but it proved that the vision would not break the film from the get-go, which, let's face it, is absolutely vital for these movies. We're always aware that these are actors in monkey makeup, but we get used to it. There's always a level of buy-in needed for a suspension of disbelief in sci-fi, but we're not repelled and we're not just laughing at it. Even when the budgets get low in later movies, and the makeup is only good quality for the major characters, the system behind it still works. Makeup artist John Chambers was selected for the film, at first making prosthetics for wounded veterans and then moving on to create a variety of TV effects, including Spock's pointy Vulcan ears in Star Trek. "You have to be very careful you don't make the audience laugh at you, but laugh along with you," said Chambers. The result was months of experimentation resulting in evocative characters blending humans with chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans, each stylized to emphasize their intelligence, aggression, or nobility, while allowing the actors underneath enough range of motion to express themselves. With their eyes, a really important part of that, as the coconut-like mouths could only move so much. Other elements, like changing the ape society from a high-tech city to a primitive world without vehicles, were due to budget limitations, but helped to differentiate the Apes world from other sci-fi franchises, as Rod Serling's script was rewritten by Michael Wilson.
A civilization where humans run wild in the jungles. And the superior beings are apes.
Planet of the Apes premiered on April 3rd, 1968, and sees a small group of astronauts crash land on a strange planet after an experimental light-speed voyage. Now, it's the year 3978, and this hostile land is ruled over by intelligent apes who hunt and experiment on primitive humans incapable of speech. But given that Taylor, played by Heston, is intelligent and can speak, his mere existence questions the validity of ape society, who believe they evolved from humans, and are a higher life form with the right to subjugate humanity. This is the story of a stranger in a strange land, trying to understand the world he's been thrust into, and ultimately try to escape the torment of his captors. But he's also surrounded by fascinating ape characters locked in an ideological battle. Chimpanzee scientists Dr. Cornelius, Roddy McDowell, and Dr. Zira, Kim Hunter, are in search of answers to the biggest questions around the history of apes and humans, while Dr. Zaius, Maurice Evans, looks to preserve the secrets that keep ape society intact and humans underfoot. And for all its big ideas, Planet of the Apes is definitely a product of the new Hollywood era. It's subversive and unconventional. Its pacing and focus is way different than what you'd expect from a modern version of this story. The first 30 minutes are focused on the astronauts' arrival and exploration of the planet, full of mystery and the tension of survival, before being punctured by the still honestly shocking arrival of apes on horseback. Of course, so much of this movie is ingrained in pop culture that you never need to have seen Planet of the Apes to know its big narrative hooks or twists. So watching the way this movie unfolds can feel a little tedious if you're just waiting for the big moments to come along. Early on, we understand Taylor's general distaste for humanity. He's disillusioned, almost a misanthrope, and was happy to go on a mission that would take him far away from the world. When he realizes they're far into the future and that everything they knew is dead, he's actually kinda happy about it. The humans of this world are so primitive that they're essentially innocent of any wrongdoing. There's nothing malicious or aggressive about them, and Taylor's connection with the human woman Nova, played by Linda Harrison, isn't really romantic. She was originally supposed to become pregnant with his child and survive while Taylor was killed, and the simplicity of their connection and need for survival underlines the cruelty of the apes. Apes is not an action movie. It's really not even an adventure movie. This is a film about ideas and conversations, often played out in labs and courts and prisons. This is pure science fiction, an exploration of ideas and conflicts. Of course, Heston is magnetic in the role and given plenty of iconic lines as the desperate, scenery-chewing protagonist.
Take your stinking paws off me, you damn dirty ape!
He can talk. He can talk, 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 he can talk!
I can sing!
But McDowell and Hunter are excellent as the scientific minds who help articulate the film's big ideas. McDowell would go on to essentially be the pillar of this entire original series, and we'll later see why he's a key reason why so much of these movies work. A predominant theme of every Apes movie, as established by the original, is the horrible nature of ignorance. Willful, institutional, the type passed down by generations. Ignorance propels hatred and oppression. Here, that's lived out most specifically in the battle between science and religion, with the apes living in a theocracy that insists on their God-given superiority to humans. Any and all evidence or advocacy for scientific findings that contradict this core tenet of how the apes live is met by violent suppression. Given that we know that apes did not evolve from humans, the film is naturally advocating for the theory of evolution by portraying a society-wide ignorance that is so clearly wrong, we can't help but accept the opposite. placing a blind religiosity as dependent on that ignorance as the guiding light behind a theocratic dystopia makes the film's critique of religion even clearer. So much of this movie is trials and hearings and characters trying to convince others of their points of view, with the film's metaphors for humanity's willful ignorance not hidden at all. It's an ideas-first sci-fi movie, and all those moments played on repeat for decades, and parodied on The Simpsons, take on a lot more meaning in the context of the film. Ultimately, the film reveals that yes, humanity is not apekind's primitive ancestors, and that the truth has been known and suppressed by Zaius for years. Ape society is America, and their enslavement of, experimentation on, and self-justification for the abuse of a group they see as inferior as deemed by their religious beliefs is so clearly reflective of the racism, oppression, class division, and war that defined much of the United States in the 60s, a time where African Americans' fight for equality was met with government-supported violence, where the country was already deep into the Vietnam War, where the Cuban Missile Crisis tiptoed to the edge of nuclear Armageddon, and where deeply different beliefs split the nation in every way. Of course, so much of the original planet's reputation in pop culture is based on its final twist, which means this movie is essentially unspoilable, but I suppose I should put in a big ol' spoiler warning right here if you've somehow clicked on an Apes video without knowing anything about this franchise.
You blew it up! Damn you! Damn you all to hell!
The film's final reveal shows that the planet Taylor landed on is Earth, far into the future, with humanity having destroyed itself in nuclear war, as the grief-stricken astronaut condemns his fellow man.
Damn you! God damn you all to hell!
This, as we've discussed, is not the ending of Boole's book, and man is it so much better. Apes was made during the height of the Cold War, when fears of nuclear war were at their highest, and for good reason. By 1968, there were already more than 37,000 nuclear warheads in the world, and the number was nowhere near its peak yet. Having the planet be Earth all along slowly formed over Rod Serling's many screenplay drafts. And in recontextualizing this planet as not a hypothetical for what could happen to our own, but what will happen to us if we stay on the path of nuclear war, Apes retroactively becomes an embodiment of modern fears. Given that Taylor is essentially a misanthrope happy to be far away from the rest of humanity in this expedition, only to then be forced to defend mankind, and finally have all of his shifting beliefs undercut by the truth of humanity's future, turns Planet of the Apes into a much more complex story. Maybe humanity was the villain this whole time. Still, it's now apekind's turn to repeat the same cycles of hate and violence. I think it really speaks to how mainstream movies are perceived these days, because despite all those bold-faced political and societal critiques, Apes wasn't met with much controversy, and instead became a solid hit at the box office, with $33.3 million, 7th highest for 1968. And what was a singular vision in science fiction soon became a series.
In civilization's final battle to answer the ultimate question, can a planet long endure, half human and half ape?
Beneath the Planet of the Apes is a truly strange movie, but one that's necessary to keep the franchise alive. Fox's interest in another movie led to Jacob soliciting ideas from both Rod Serling and Pierre Boulle. Serling's sequel ideas revolved around Taylor fighting off the apes with old human technology, and eventually leaving the planet in a spaceship, while Boulle's treatment was titled Planet of the Men, and sees Taylor lead a group of primitive humans in a war against the apes, with Taylor killed and the apes conquered. However, Jacobs rejected their pitches and eventually hired writer Paul Dane, who had co-written James Bond's Goldfinger, and director Don Medford. However, the film ran into several massive problems. First, Heston didn't want to return, finding a sequel to be artistically bankrupt. Then Fox, who had suffered several major box office bombs, slashed the budget down to under $3 million, leading to Medford leaving the movie and Ted Post hired as his replacement. Heston, however, was convinced to return under the condition that he had minimal screen time, was killed off, and that his salary was donated to charity. Which, okay, based. Given its challenges in being made, Beneath operates as half remake of the first, as astronaut John Brent, played by James Franciscus operating essentially as Heston Light, lands on the planet after a search mission for Taylor. The movie then recreates the original with Brent meeting Nova and encountering the same characters in Ape City. In its second half, our characters travel to the Forbidden Zone in search of Taylor and find New York City buried underground, and home to mutated humans that have psychic powers and horrible deformities from the nuclear bomb they worship as a god. There are a lot of weird and wild ideas in Beneath's second half, but so much of it is so obviously making up for the lack of Heston to continue the story that it becomes a much weaker movie and having to shape its narrative around its production problems. Its much smaller budget for a large-scale movie is very evident too, most obviously in how background apes wear rubber masks instead of makeup to save time and money. That's okay, it's just super obvious in every shot they're in. And in a series known for bleak endings, Beneath's is the bleakest by a long shot, as the guerrilla army and the mutant humans go to war, with Taylor and Brent fatally shot in the fighting. And as Taylor's plea for Zaius' help and sympathy is rejected, that orangutan is an asshole. Our lead human uses the last of his strength to detonate the Alpha Omega nuclear bomb and wipe out the entire planet. Its finality underlined by a cold voiceover.
In one of the countless billions of galaxies in the universe lies a medium-sized star, and one of its satellites, a green and insignificant planet, is now dead.
The great nuclear fears that quietly underlined the first film become horrifically fulfilled in the second. That's a much darker ending than what Dane had written, as his original ending would flash forward to humans, apes, and human-ape hybrids having survived in the future, and finally achieving a truly peaceful world. Heston, on the other hand, already despising the idea of sequels, thought the whole planet should die with him, and convinced Fox president Richard Zanuck to demand the darker ending. "I didn't want that ending," said director Ted Post. "I thought it was a very negative, pessimistic ending, very unhopeful. We did have other endings, but the order came down from Dick. His conclusion about the picture was a reflection either consciously or unconsciously of what he felt. Seemingly, what happened was that the powers that be took the suggestion of a selfish egotist. He didn't want the series to go on anymore. It was a very personal attitude, one which had nothing to do with the future of the story, and maybe providing employment later for more people, with the possibility of this becoming a series. Beneath would make $19 million, a rare win for Fox at the time. But where could the series possibly go from here?
This is Dr. Zira, her loving husband Cornelius, and little Milo. The most dangerous to man is little Milo. Why?
The film that became Escape from the Planet of the Apes began with a telegram from Jacobs to screenwriter Paul Dane with 4 words. Apes exist, sequel required. But how do you write around a vaporized planet when you don't have any Dragon Balls? The answer? The past. Escape, directed by Don Taylor and written by Paul Dane, opens with Cornelius, Zira, and new character Dr. Milo arriving on present-day Earth after commandeering Taylor's spaceship and traveling back in time during Earth's nuclear destruction. Now, with their mere existence and their hiding of both the Ape Kingdom's barbaric treatment of humanity and the Earth's eventual destruction causing controversy in modern America, Zirus and Cornelius, R.I.P. Milo, a real one, first become celebrities and then targets of government assassination with the revelation that Zira is pregnant. Will Zira and Cornelius's child spell doom for humanity? Or will humanity kill the apes to save themselves? With the franchise at a seeming end and a sequel only given a budget of $2.5 million and 6 weeks to shoot, Escape's time travel plot is a bit of brilliant creativity. Not only does this premise create the potential for a time loop, with plenty of room for sequels in the space between, but the present-day setting means fewer sets, only a few actors in ape makeup, and no need to create a brand new world. I also think that Escape is the most brilliant entry in the series, taking on a much more comedic and subversive tone thanks to the sheer outlandishness of placing our evolved apes into the real world, only to slowly grow darker and more dangerous. Cornelius, played by a returning Roddy McDowall who had to miss Beneath, and Zira, Kim Hunter once again, are by no means innocent characters, but they become tragic heroes because of the ignorance and fear aimed at them by everyday civilians and the government. This is all essentially an inversion of the first film's dynamic, blurring the lines more and more between humanity and ape as the worst of man's tendencies toward hatred and fear overcome initial feelings of curiosity and amusement. There is some hope for understanding, with 2 animal doctors and circus owner Armando, played by the great Ricardo Montalban, already sympathetic to animals, and naturally transferring their understanding to the apes. Maybe the wildest thing about Escape, an ape romance turned cultural satire that shifts into a government-mandated assassination tragedy, is that, like the rest of the films in the original series, it was seen as an all-ages picture with a sizable kid audience. It's an incredibly different point of view of what's appropriate for a young audience than today. And while parents may disagree, I love that there's a level of trust and audience sophistication before a much harder split came in the designation between kids' movies and adult films. Like every original Apes movie, Escape ends on an extremely dark note, with Cornelius, Zira, and their newborn son unflinchingly gunned down by a government agent. They shoot a baby, an ape baby, but still a baby. In retrospect, Escape makes these first 3 movies much more of Cornelius and Zira's story, and not any human character, making their deaths far more painful. There is, however, a glimmer of hope, revealing that the couple swapped their newborn son with another chimp at the circus, leaving the future of ape and human in doubt. And while Escape made less than Beneath with $12.3 million total, it was still strong enough against its shrinking budget to warrant more.
Now, the biggest, the newest, the most exciting of all the Planet of the Apes pictures. Climaxed by the spectacular Revolt of the Apes.
The cycle of seemingly definitive ends begetting smaller sequels continued with 1972's Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, written once again by Paul Dane and directed by J. Lee Thompson. However, Jacobs could see that shrinking budgets and profits could soon spell the end of Apes. According to Dane, Arthur Jacobs said he thought it would be the last, so I fitted it together so that it fitted in with the beginning of Apes 1, so that the wheel had come full circle and one could stop there quite happily, I think. And with a budget of only $1.7 million, this story of the conflict that reshapes the world is a sort of minor miracle, with the team filming the majority of the film at the University of California, Irvine, leveraging its brutalist architecture style by William Pereira to convey the future, complete with jackbooted soldiers and a sudden dystopia, revealing how the world has very quickly gone to shit in the time since Escape. Conquest begins 18 years after the last, and in the time since, baby Milo has been raised as Caesar by the sympathetic Armando, while apes have become slaves to humans, replacing cats and dogs wiped out by a plague, while the government cracks down on any chance that a talking ape may fulfill Cornelius and Zira's prophecy. But in line with the series' themes of ignorance begetting world-changing conflict, Caesar is found out by the authorities, and his imprisonment and torture alongside his kind sparks violent revolution. McDowell now plays Caesar, son of his own character Cornelius, and solidifying himself as the pillar of the franchise. It's a much more conflicted, layered role, turning from inquisitive and sensitive newcomer to raging conqueror, and it shows just how fantastic McDowell was behind the mask.
Lousy human bastards!
Here, the Apes franchise takes on its most blatant social and racial critique, inspired by the Watts riots in 1965, where segregation, racial tensions, police abuse, and a violent arrest sparked a 6-day-long riot, with more than 30,000 people taking part in Los Angeles. Conquest creates a more intense racial pressure cooker of entitled humans and the apes they abuse for their own profit, underlining how rebellion is only a matter of time. Black government employee Malcolm McDonald, played by Harry Rhodes, really makes the connection explicit, as Caesar appeals to McDonald's slave ancestry, asking him to understand the ape plight, which he does despite some objections. It's a tricky balance, and while Conquest ultimately warns against armed conflict, the extremity of the ape's exploitation at human hands really makes no other option possible. The ending of Conquest, however, is extremely controversial, both then and now. At its end, Caesar's rebellion defeats the police and overthrows the local institutions, grabbing main villain Governor Breck and beating him to death, with Caesar declaring war on all humanity.
Our own religion, our own dynasty, and that day is upon you now!
The ending was, unsurprisingly, controversial and was changed for the theatrical release, mostly by reversing footage, cutting up scenes, and using extreme close-ups alongside a new voiceover by McDowell that emphasized the ape's peaceful resolution.
If it is man's destiny to be dominated, it is God's will that he be dominated with compassion,
In either case, Conquest shows how the world was set on the course to a planet of apes. But I find that every entry of the original 5 is a cautionary tale complete with a bleak ending, warning of how ignorance, hatred, and violence destroy the good in us. Conquest is a much stronger and more coherent story with its original ending. And yet, this wasn't the end. Its $9.7 million box office was essentially pure profit against a minuscule budget. And so, one more story was designed to complete the loop.
Climaxing the epic series which made motion picture history comes the last, the most spectacular of all the ape adventures.
1973's Battle for the Planet of the Apes is, while not the worst of the franchise, easily the most disappointing. It's a story designed to fully close the loop, but is full of compromises that harm the end result. Paul Dane once again wrote a script, but his story of a massive conflict between apes and humans that culminates in Caesar's murder, the rise of the mutants, the creation of the Forbidden Zone, and the subjugation of humanity was rejected and rewritten by John William Corrington and Joyce Hooper Corrington, becoming Battle, directed by J. Lee Thompson. And with a budget of $1.8 million and shooting primarily done outdoors at a water treatment plant, you can feel Fox tightening their grip and demanding the end of the franchise. It doesn't help that the altered ending of Conquest demands a very different film than what was intended. And here, Caesar leads a civilization of coexisting humans and apes, trying to keep the peace while a mutant army arrives to destroy them, with the entire story shown as a lesson by the Lawgiver, previously only mentioned in ape history, trying to teach humans and apes to coexist. How does this story connect to the original? Is it intended to rewrite history? Did anyone know what they were doing when making this backyard school assignment video? Who knows? But what everyone involved did know was that this was the end. The conclusion of Battle didn't just bring the end of the original Apes story, it was the last of the franchise produced by the man responsible for bringing it to the big screen in the first place. On June 27, 1973, just 2 weeks after Battle's premiere, Arthur P. Jacobs passed away from a sudden heart attack at the age of 51. Jacobs' production company, APJAC Productions, then quickly sold the rights to 20th Century Fox, who has held them ever since. However, Jacobs' influence on the series wasn't over yet. The producer had begun planning a TV series in 1971. With the Apes movies drawing big numbers for CBS when they were first aired, the channel and Fox moved forward with a live-action series, simply titled Planet of the Apes, eventually going on to premiere on September 13, 1974, with 14 episodes made for the station. The show essentially does the original movie over again, as well as incorporating some elements of Beneath, with Roddy McDowall returning as a new character, the young Galen, who works with the human characters. However, the shortened first season struggled to gain an audience, and was cancelled at the end of its only season. In fact, one of the episodes was never aired, titled The Liberator. It essentially translated Beneath's Alpha Omega cult, only this time with poisonous gas as the weapon of mass destruction, and seen as a controversial comment on the Vietnam War and more global conflicts. The series' final episode aired on December 20th, 1974, and CBS did not pick up a second season. In its place came the animated Return to the Planet of the Apes, airing on Saturday mornings on NBC for 13 episodes at the end of 1975. Return is a much looser retelling of the Apes story, really only having the general setup of the original movie. However, this too performed poorly, and failed to get renewed. Apes on TV was totally over by the end of 1975, and with that, the franchise would be dormant for the next quarter of a century, despite efforts to revive it. When a remake was finally made, the result would be the franchise's biggest misstep.
One day they'll tell a story, and some will say it was just a fairy tale about a human who came from the stars and changed our world.
The path to a Planet of the Apes remake begins in 1988 with a surprisingly modern approach to franchise revival, as Fox commissioned writer Adam Rifkin to write a sequel to the original film titled Planet of the Apes: The Final Battle that ignored the other movies. The main concept would be that the ape empire had reached its Roman era. A descendant of Charlton Heston's character would eventually lead a human slave revolt against the oppressive Roman-esque apes. A real sword and sandal spectacular, monkey style. It's very Halloween 4: The Return of Michael Myers, and also Halloween H2O, and Halloween 2018, and probably whatever Halloween movie they make next. Anyway, Executive turnover at Fox led to Rifkin rewriting his script several times until the project was officially cancelled, soon leading to Peter Jackson and Fran Walsh, who seem to pop up in every one of these retrospectives when the franchise hits the 90s, pitching a story in 1992 that followed on from Battle. Here, ape society would be in the midst of a renaissance, and a human revolt led by a half-human, half-ape main character. McDowell agreed to return as a Leonardo da Vinci-like ape, but once again, Fox leadership changed, and Jackson was out. Next were producers Jane Hampshire and Don Murphy alongside director Oliver Stone in 1993. Murphy wanted a brand new story that had nothing to do with apes beyond using the title to make an action movie, while Stone said he thought the original films were awful. Stone revealed his pitch to revolve around ancient civilizations and Bible secrets, saying, "It has the discovery of cryogenically frozen Vedic apes, who hold the secret numeric codes to the Bible and foretold the end of civilizations. It deals with past versus the future. My concept is there's a code inscribed in the Bible that predicts all historical events. The apes were there at the beginning and figured it all out." Oliver, that sounds like shit. With a screenplay by Terry Hayes, this ape starts in the future where a genetic time bomb plague is wiping out humanity, leading to scientists time traveling to the distant past to save humanity from evolved apes. And while Philip Noyce was attached as director and Arnold Schwarzenegger as star, with a $100 million budget, battles with Fox executives over the screenplay led to another unmade film. This was followed by director Chris Columbus and writer Sam Hamm, whose movie would see two separate planets like Boole's novel, with an ape astronaut landing on Earth and spreading a plague, causing our heroes to travel to his ape planet to find a cure. Didn't get made. And then James Cameron was brought on board, although his team never produced a finished screenplay. This leads us to Tim Burton joining the project in 1999, heavily rewriting a script by William Broyles Jr. that was extremely heavy on religious parallels and had little to do with the Apes novels or movies. Broyles would complete more rewrites, but eventually quit out of frustrations with Burton. And after sitting on the rights to the property for decades without anything to show for it, Fox had their release date set in stone. It was just a matter of the crew making the movie in time. Burton's Planet of the Apes remake is a big old butt full of doo-doo and was a massive production with a $100 million budget, filming around the world and on massive sets. The story is familiar, with an astronaut landing on an alien planet where advanced apes rule over humanity, who can talk, they're just oppressed, and a dark secret that could change everything. The budget and effects are easily the most impressive thing about the movie, with Rick Baker's prosthetics achieving a sort of detail and expressiveness the original films never could, almost to an uncomfortable degree of uncanniness. Some actors, like Tim Roth as the evil General Thade, really eat their parts up. Others, like Mark Wahlberg as hero Captain Davidson, feel like a mannequin is being puppeted around as our lead. Unfortunately, it's all in service to a film that has absolutely no idea what to do with its central premise. A dash of political intrigue here, a little ancient mystery there, a whole lot of sci-fi gobbledygook to glue it all together, and one of the all-time worst endings in film history. Taking Boole's novel's ending and making it total nonsense, as Thade has somehow taken over Earth's past off-screen. It's such a mess that DVDs of the movie came with a paper insert explaining what the fuck actually happened. There's just something really missing here, and it's clear that Burton was in over his head with a massive film that echoed the scope of his Batman movies, but with none of the creativity. Burton's career post-Apes is pretty dire, with almost every movie being the same type of big-budget, soulless IP cash grab. Here, spectacle comes first, character second, story a distant third. Released on July 27, 2001, Apes wasn't a disaster, but with a $362 million box office, it was absolutely underwhelming for Fox, who were hoping this would bring back a popular franchise the studio had missed for decades. Afterward, the studio canceled their plans for a sequel, while Burton said he'd rather jump out a window than make another one. After a solid 13 years of trying to bring the franchise back, Apes was dead again. It would be another 10 years before it would return.
They are contaminated. Put those apes down.
You have no idea what you're dealing with.
By 2006, 20th Century Fox was ready to try again, with screenwriters Amanda Silver and Rick Jaffa as the major creative voices pushing forward with Planet of the Apes: Genesis. Inspired by news stories on the rise of chimpanzees being raised by people in their homes and genetic engineering breakthroughs, Jaffa said, "We constructed the narrative around this one bit of apes mythology which comes from Escape, where they talk about the first chimp that spoke. So we knew that was going to be a big part of the narrative. And we kind of worked forwards and backwards and we kind of built to that." Director Scott Frank was briefly attached and wanted to change Silver and Jaffa's script to suit his own vision, but quickly left, putting the original writers back in charge as Fox hired Rupert Wyatt to direct a film that's part remake, part reboot, part prequel. Debuting on August 5th, 2011, Rise takes place in the modern day and depicts how our world began its path to the ape-dominated future of the original, as scientist Will Rodman, played by James Franco, is working on a cure for Alzheimer's, with chimpanzees the primary trial subject at his big pharma company. When their most successful test subject gives birth to a son and is killed, Will raises the chimp he names Caesar, who is far smarter than any other ape because of the drug's effects. Of course, things go wrong and Caesar is sent to an abusive primate shelter, eventually leading an uprising while the drug tests begin a plague. With Andy Serkis performing motion capture and voicing Caesar, working with visual effects studio Weta Workshop, who he had worked with as Gollum on Lord of the Rings and Kong in the King Kong remake, our lead chimp is really the standout aspect of the entire movie. Caesar is given such amazing, detailed life as a fully CGI creation and feels alive. These effects will only become better in the next two movies, but he's a really compelling character who grows, struggles, and ultimately becomes a savior. All the best moments in the film are his. No! I think the smartest move made in Rise is that the film begins by making you believe that this is Will's story, with a lot of its first half devoted to his decisions and growing relationship with Frida Pinto's Caroline, only for the film to flip halfway through and make Caesar the true central character, staying with him and following his struggles in captivity. Given that Caesar is a chimpanzee, a special one but still a chimp with all the characteristics of a real one, Rise is less a metaphor for a specific human struggle, and more of a one-to-one story about animal cruelty and experimentation. The rise in consciousness of the rest of his fellow apes gives characters like Maurice and Rocket more human-like intelligence, but Rise also makes sure to show these apes as conscious and emotional, with the killing of Caesar's mother, Bright Eyes, early on, a really tragic and brutal moment. The focus on Will is also what makes Rise the least successful of this new trilogy, as Franco is just really boring as our temporary lead, and his story is the most generic element of the film. Franco checked out while getting a big paycheck? No way. And thankfully, Rise doesn't try to fit exactly into the past Apes films, but instead is telling its own original version, which gives it and the films that follow a wide open path to new stories, while still homaging what came before. Given that this is Caesar and a story of apes rebelling against human oppression, Rise has elements of both escape and conquest. However, Caesar's goals in Rise are much more like Caesar's reshot speech at the end of Conquest. Like that voiceover replacement, Caesar doesn't want to kill humans as revenge, but instead just wants freedom for his species, retreating into the forests outside San Francisco in search of a better home. Together, Rise, Dawn, and War essentially remake Conquest and Battle for the Planet of the Apes, with their narratives exclusively focused on a modern-day conflict between apes and humans, the rise of Caesar as the leader of the apes,
Caesar is home,
and the gradual fall of humanity. The end of Rise reveals how this small modern struggle will reshape the planet, as the simian flu begins to spread around the globe. Obviously, without time travel and with a virus causing humanity's regression instead of a vague de-evolution, Rise is presenting its story in a much more grounded manner, despite its high concept of a talking chimp. Appropriate for a time when the approach of Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy and the less flashy entries in Daniel Craig's James Bond films were dominating the box office. The approach paid off, with Rise making $411 million against its $93 million budget, giving the franchise a level of success and prestige it had never really had with mainstream audiences. And while I think that the original Apes movies are much more sophisticated and deeper than what their reputation is in the mainstream, Rise and its trilogy really reshaped what people thought about the franchise. The ending of Rise doesn't demand a sequel. You can easily connect the dots from here, with an Easter egg of Taylor's spaceship making that all really easy to do. But Fox finally had critical and commercial success with their Stop and Start franchise. They were ready for more. While Wyatt and Serkis were quickly announced for a sequel to Rise, Wyatt soon left the film and was replaced by Matt Reeves as director, with a script by Amanda Silver, Rick Jaffa, and Mark Baumbach, with a much bigger budget of $170 million to afford a bigger scope, cast, and complex effects for a whole colony of advanced apes. Dawn begins 10 years after Rise, with the simian flu wiping out all of humanity except for a tiny portion who are genetically immune. Now, Caesar leads his apes in the wilderness outside of San Francisco, while the city is home to a small society of human survivors. Soon, these two groups come into conflict due to human leader Dreyfus, Gary Oldman, and vengeful bonobo Koba, Toby Kebbell, wanting to destroy each other's group out of years of hatred. By jumping past the initial collapse of the world, Dawn places itself in a much more unique setting and turns Caesar into a leader with many more personal ties and struggles as a husband and father. Meanwhile, I think that the small human family that becomes our co-leads, with Jason Clarke as Malcolm, Kerry Russell as Ellie, and Cody Smith-McPhee as Alexander, are the best human characters in the entire franchise. Their struggle to understand one another, bridge the gap with Caesar, and fight to keep the peace is really compelling and heartbreaking. These are very lived-in, broken performances, and their moments of love and connection bring a softness that punctuates a dark and desperate story. Toby Kebbell's Koba returns after a minor but terrifying supporting role in Rise as the main antagonist, essentially becoming Caesar's opposite, abused by humans and now driven to destroy humanity and propel ape-kind to war. The conflict between Caesar and Koba is the battle over both ape and human future, with Caesar embracing a greater understanding of humankind, while Koba represents how the original series apes saw them as worthy of eradication. I also really love how these films handle the ape's ability to speak. Serkis talks in a hushed, deliberate pacing, able to talk but only when necessary.
A good man. Like you.
Koba shouts every word, like he's overcoming a natural difficulty talking through pure hatred, and commanding loyalty through anger.
Humans! Kill Caesar!
It's choices like this, combined with advanced Weta CGI that essentially removes all uncanniness, that makes me completely forget these are fully digital characters. That's incredible. Reeves also has a flash for dark, fiery, near-apocalyptic conflict, making the viewer feel like a reporter embedded in a military battle. Dawn is a story about the edge of conflict, tipping points where a single decision can lead to death and destruction. In the continuing vein of ignorance, Dreyfus is clearly resentful of the apes, and ultimately will do anything to kill them, seeing them as monsters, while Koba sees all of humanity as abusers. There's no peace when these voices take hold of power. I really love how Dawn is both large in scope, depicting a post-apocalyptic ruined urban landscape where our heroes must journey to save their societies, and also stays extremely intimate with a small cast and quiet conversations being just as vital as any action set piece. With its story of societies at war, Dawn is commenting much more on humanity's proclivities toward conflict, and questions what causes us to dehumanize the other and pursue violence. There are no easy answers, and with an ending that sees war as inevitable despite understanding being found, I find the film to be heartbreaking in the best way possible. With its release on July 11, 2014, Dawn went on to become the biggest hit in franchise history, with a $710 million worldwide box office. That's really huge, and a massive increase from Rise. There was quickly talk of what would come next, with both Serkis and Reeves unsure if Part 3 would pick up right where Dawn ended, and how many more would be planned. But what came next brought the end of Caesar's story.
I did not start this war.
War for the Planet of the Apes premiered on July 14, 2017, and brings back Matt Reeves as director, this time sharing a co-writing credit with a returning Mark Baumbach. And while war continues the cliffhanger of Dawn as Caesar's apes are now fighting the remaining human military, this trilogy capper takes place 2 years after the last. Now, Caesar and his apes are fighting the forces of Woody Harrelson's Colonel, taking human lives when necessary but unwilling participants in the war Koba started. However, the murder of Caesar's wife Cornelia and his eldest son Blue Eyes put the ape leader on a quest for revenge, and war becomes less of a war movie and more 50% journey and 50% concentration camp rebellion, as Caesar fights to free his tribe after they've been captured by the military. That story alone should tell you that War is a very dark movie, the darkest of a trilogy that was already pretty serious, and a finale that's intent on bringing Caesar's story to an end. Now, Serkis' character, haunted by visions of Koba, struggles to save his people and the military's threat, and choose whether to give in to revenge or stay noble. Meanwhile, the simian flu has mutated, slowly removing humanity's ability to speak, and turning them into the primitive creatures of the original series. War pays homage to various elements of the original movies, with Colonel McCullough's military force named Alpha Omega, referencing Beneath's atomic bomb that would go on to wipe out all life. Meanwhile, Caesar and his group find a young girl they name Nova, who has lost her ability to speak. But instead of being a slave, Nova is cared for as one of their own. These little tweaks show that while Reeves' films blur the line of morality, they have more hope for the future of the world than what the original films illustrated. And while I've already said it before, I have to reiterate that Weta Digital's visual effects and motion capture work for the Apes is so incredible. You almost immediately forget that you're watching CGI characters, and instead buy into them as living, breathing, intelligent animals. That's really the ultimate sign of incredible CGI work. You forget about the spectacle and buy into this as reality, which is extremely important in movies that want you to invest in its characters as fully formed individuals. Serkis is incredible here, bringing a massive amount of gravitas as a Caesar who has lost everything, and is barely holding on for the sake of his tribe. Meanwhile, Corinne Conneval as Maurice is given the most screen time yet, as essentially the secondary character of the film, while Steve Zahn as Bad Ape really steals the show as a traumatized chimp that's able to speak, bringing a very different perspective to the conflict. And Harrelson, while kinda one-dimensional as a villain, brings the needed menace. In the end, Caesar isn't like Caesar at all. He's Moses, saved from being killed when the rest of his kind were put down by the pharmaceutical company, saving his fellow apes from captivity, leading them to the promised land, but never able to enter it himself. That's beautiful and heartbreaking. A perfect end for a character whose entire existence is marked by loss and sacrifice, in the hopes of something better for his species. Given that this trilogy has made itself totally distinct from the original timeline, I don't think this Apes series has to end in oppression and extinction, which makes this a purely hopeful, bittersweet ending. While Fox had already envisioned war as the end of the story, the film would also go on to make $490 million, strong against its $150 million budget, but a $220 million drop from Dawn's total. I can't say it's too surprising. Summer 2017 was insane with giant franchise movies. Guardians, Spider-Man, Pirates, Wonder Woman, Despicable Me, Transformers, Cars, Alien, oh, and The Mummy was here too. And war was advertised, accurately, almost impossible not to show as, a very grim movie. And I feel as though Apes has always been that other sci-fi series, compared to the heavy hitters. So while I would say War is better than all of those other movies except maybe GOTG 2, it was super tough for it to compete. There are enough hints in War to set up future stories, such as Nova, the other ape colonies, and a possibly returning Taylor that could all have new versions. But with the film's underperformance, plans for more stories went into hibernation, until a new vision could reinvigorate the modern franchise.
Apes hunt humans. That is wrong.
In the time between War and Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, 20th Century Fox was purchased by Disney, meaning that the House of Mouse now owned the rights to the Apes franchise. So while Reeves had expressed interest in future movies exploring apes that evolved without Caesar's leadership, it wasn't until the Disney purchase that development actually began on a new film. In December of 2019, Disney officially announced that Wes Ball would bring the next film to life, after having previously worked with the studio on the cancelled Mouse Guard adaptation, which they axed late into development. A crime, I tell you. A crime. The only thing I love more than a talking ape is a talking mouse with a freaking sword. This would lead to Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, released on May 10th, 2024, and directed by Wes Ball with a screenplay by Josh Friedman. Kingdom takes place in unspecified, many generations after the death of Caesar, as the world has fully changed over to a planet of apes. Here we focus on young chimpanzee Noah, played by Owen Teague, who sets off on a journey to free his tribe after they're captured by the forces of Proximus Caesar, played by Kevin Durand, meeting a human named May, Freya Allen, and discovering hidden secrets of the world that his isolated tribe kept from him. Kingdom is the single most adventure-focused film in the entire Apes franchise, with a huge scope and a journey that not only covers many different lands, but is built on the thrill of discovery. It's also got enough climbing-focused action scenes to be the one true Uncharted movie. And while its separation from the Serkis trilogy lets those films stand on their own, Kingdom is all about how beliefs and legacies can be warped over generations, and twisted to fit the agendas of those in power, with Proximus using Caesar's teachings to fit his own evil rule. To say more would be to spoil the movie, so here's your spoiler warning. Jump to this time code to avoid the details. The big surprise to me is that Noah's Eagle Clan tribe has formed completely outside the influence of Caesar, but are our heroes. Instead, it's Proximus Caesar's kingdom that has descended from the end of the original trilogy, and are using Caesar's words to gain power, with the kingdom trying to open a military bunker and access human weaponry to rule the world. Of course, this poisoning of Caesar's legacy is contrasted by Noah learning about who Caesar actually was, through the orangutan Raka, the only one left to spread the gospel. It's a gorgeous looking movie too, filled with lush greens and really dynamic action sequences, with Weta returning in conjunction with real locations being filmed. Once again, the modern Ape movies look leagues better than most of today's franchises. While Kingdom works without the context of the trilogy, its ideas are much stronger with them in mind, as ultimately these larger themes are more extra flavoring on top of an adventure story that can be enjoyed on its own. It's definitely a slower paced journey, often taking its time to explore the world and reveal its history to Noah, and therefore the viewer, instead of barreling forward into the next set piece. Thankfully, I really like the characters, with Noah a strong lead that's almost Luke Skywalker-esque, Raka a really compelling source of wisdom that I wish had more time, and Proximus Caesar a charismatic and unconventional villain that should have been a major presence throughout instead of mostly in the third act. May is the film's biggest source of mystery, eventually revealed as capable of speech, and near the end shown to be on a mission to reconnect a large military remnant of still intelligent humans. This is Kingdom's big hook for sequels, and is almost a substitute for the Nuke Mutants. However, I don't think May's story is nearly as interesting as Noah's, with it taking up more and more time as the film progresses. Still, I think the bunker climax is a great bit of claustrophobic tension that reveals how this new trilogy will likely lean into more conventional thrills than what came before. End of spoilers. With a $165 million budget, Kingdom is a sizable production, but Ball has already expressed hopes that this will be the first part of a new trilogy. My hope is that the films that come next push further into metaphor and moral complexity, taking full advantage of this new ape world that has so many possibilities.
What a wonderful day!
If there's any franchise I think is most similar to Planet of the Apes, it's Star Trek. Both were majorly impactful in their early years, were undercut by shrinking budgets, and were kept alive by niche but devout fans for decades, with big-budget mainstream studio reboots trying to revive the franchises to varying degrees of success. But Apes doesn't have nearly the amount of media that Trek does. A few video games, some comic books that either intersect with the original movies or cross over into other franchises, including Star Trek, Tarzan, and Green Lantern, and both original books and novelizations that translate the movies, but don't act as sequels to the original book. Yeah, that's a little confusing. Anyway, my point is that despite being around for more than 5 decades, the Apes franchise is fairly small and insular, feeling much more curated and focused than most other popular works that have stayed in the public consciousness for so long. And maybe that's because making these movies has almost always been so challenging, to the point of putting people off making them for the majority of the series' existence. Thankfully, the mix of modern CGI advancements and strong new visions for the franchise have brought more life into the series than it's ever had. That's something I don't think even Boole, Jacobs, or McDowell would have ever expected to happen long after they passed. But their visions live on. And as I do with every retrospective, here's every Planet of the Apes movie ranked. At 10, Planet of the Apes from 2001. The only truly bad Apes movie. The most frustrating thing about Burton's Apes remake is that such a massive budget, great special effects, and makeup that really fulfills the aspirations of the originals is placed in service of a terrible story, script, and direction that doesn't know what to do with its potential. So much of this movie is about the world, and none of it is about the social issues that made Apes important in the first place. This movie helped me realize that movies could be bad when I saw it as a kid. In making this video, it reminded me that they still could be. At 9, Battle for the Planet of the Apes. The original Apes movies come to a close with a whimper. Budget issues and writing challenges obviously hindered this one, but it's just so boring. The social issues and commentary aren't there. We're basically stuck outside with nothing interesting to look at, and the way this movie closes the loop on the Apes story, the sole reason for it existing, is pointless. This is like the MGS5 of Apes movies. Connective tissue that seems like a good premise, but is ultimately not worth it. At 8, Beneath the Planet of the Apes. Beneath is a movie split right down the middle. Its first half is essentially remaking the original with a new lead due to Heston not wanting to be more than a cameo, but its second half is bold, grim, and even more nihilistic than the original. Adding in the mutant humans adds a new layer of darkness to Apes' history, here pushing further into religion, obsession, and hatred, reiterating the original's nuclear fears and fulfilling them on screen. I wish this could have just been the second half expanded to a full film, without the retreading that weighs it down. At 7, Rise of the Planet of the Apes. A split movie, working to freshen up the general ideas found in Escape and Conquest, lay the groundwork for its own unique story, and then give Caesar's rebellion enough time to resonate. The first half is serviceable, full of too much Franco and kinda interchangeable with any other mid-budget modern sci-fi of the time. Rupert Wyatt gives this a very bland palette and unremarkable perspective. The second half, where Caesar becomes our lead character, is fantastic, with an incredible performance by Serkis and the rest of the motion capture crew, turning into a really compelling story of rebellion. At 6, Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. A really well done adventure that's strong enough to carry on the legacy of the new trilogy. Kingdom is maybe the most conventional film in the series outside of the Cursed remake, but that's not a bad thing when it's this well done and the characters are this strong. There's a surprising lack of political or philosophical metaphor here in favor of world building and setting up future movies that shows this film's franchise aspirations. But the small themes of how our best intentions can decay and be twisted over the centuries adds layers to a really strong, epic story. Needed more Proxima Caesar. At 5, War for the Planet of the Apes. A massive emotional climax to the modern Caesar trilogy. I think that even with all the spectacle and incredible action, it's the characters that are constantly the most special thing here, with the small focus giving Caesar, Maurice, and my own personal MVP Bad Ape lots of time to become complex individuals. The only downside is that it sort of feels like War is skipping to the finale of what could have been a larger and more complex story, but this still works really well as the end of what this trilogy is getting at. Serkis as Caesar is simply one of the all-time great characters of sci-fi. At 4, Conquest of the Planet of the Apes. A blisteringly angry story of a slave rebellion. I love how Conquest is fearless in its commentary on American racial politics and the historical impact of slavery. Roddy McDowall is even more incredible here, even as the budget continues to shrink, but the crew is squeezing every cent out of its budget by turning the UCI campus into a dystopian microcosm. It's a pressure cooker of societal tensions waiting to boil over. Also, the unrated original ending is absolutely necessary for this story to truly work, letting its anger and cruelty explode without walking it back out of fear of how the film will be perceived. At 3, the original Planet of the Apes. The original Apes is pure, heady sci-fi focused on conversations, ideas, and intellectual struggle planted in a high-concept world. Having a misanthropic character forced to reckon with a new form of humanity as essentially an animal and advocate for his personhood creates a really biting, cynical commentary on man's willful ignorance. Great sci-fi takes complex real-world issues that some people might refuse to interact with in their personal lives and refracts it through an unexpected lens to let ideas and messages penetrate deeper into the minds of viewers. Apes does that wonderfully while still being a compelling and unpredictable adventure all on its own. Turns out this movie still works really well even after you've watched The Simpsons parody it for decades. At 2, Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. One hell of a film. Dawn is able to be both an epic struggle of factions that are so similar they refuse to understand each other, and a very intimate story of understanding and compassion at the exact same time. The secret is that for as massive as the film seems, its scope is much smaller than you might expect, with the survival of a single city meaning everything for the future of the world. Serkis as Caesar is one of the all-time great performances, but Jason Clarke, Kerry Russell, Toby Kebbell, and more really bring it for easily the most emotionally resonant film of the franchise. This thing honks, or I guess it ooh-ooh-ah-ahs. And at number 1, Escape from the Planet of the Apes. Quite possibly the strangest outlier of the series, with its then modern focus and a story that essentially flips the script of the original. Escape is the most successful in its ideas, messages, and characters, because it's so tightly focused on ideas of ignorance, fear, and distrust. Escape moves from farce to tragedy, and solidifies Cornelius and Zira as two of the best characters in the series. And really, all of the best characters of the franchise are apes. Montalban shows up in the third act and throws heaters for 10 minutes like an ace closer. Like the original, this will take you on a wild ride, but hits way harder, because it's only just barely removed from the real world. Prior to making this video, I'd only seen a few of the Apes films, but after watching through the entire franchise, I can easily say that I think it's one of the greatest sci-fi franchises of all time. And that's thanks to the uniqueness of its vision, which is essentially unreplicable. and the really sharp political and ideological criticisms that are made possible by it. Not only that, but more than 50 years of beginnings, endings, and reinventions have shown that what seems like a very narrow idea can be changed and reapplied to many different meanings to suit the times. Like any great sci-fi work, Apes speaks to its time and then allows future generations to revisit it and see new viewpoints outside of their own, thanks to pure creativity. Will Kingdom lead to even more ape stories? Or will the end come once again? As long as there's something in our world the franchise can speak to, this is a cycle that will never end.
I love you, Dr. Zayas!
Thanks for watching today's video, and thanks for joining me on this wild, extra long ride that is a trip through the Planet of the Apes franchise. As I said, before doing research and watching all the movies for this video, I was never really that into Planet of the Apes, but doing this has made me into a massive fan. I just love so many of these movies, and I really think there are only 2 bad movies in the entire franchise. Everything else I think is truly worth watching. And despite being more than 50 years old, I still think that the bold political and social commentary of so many of these movies is often shocking and refreshing. It's a series that absolutely does not pull its punches, and delivers some of the bleakest endings over and over again, to the point where you can't really understand where the franchise would go at all after some of these movies end. It's also filled with fascinating behind-the-scenes stories. And a big help in my research, and something that I would recommend to anyone interested in apes, is the feature-length documentary Behind the Planet of the Apes. It goes into so much detail about the production of every single movie of the original franchise, with a lot of the people involved who were still alive during the making of the documentary, which happened in the late 90s, giving fascinating behind-the-scenes stories and perspectives. And now with Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes out, I'm very interested to see where this franchise goes next. And I hope that it does well, because I think there really is so much juice left in this story, and so many different ways that it could go. The new series really is not beholden to the old original movies at all, and I hope they go in very different directions. I'd love to hear what your favorite Planet of the Apes movies are, as well as what you hope for the future of the franchise. As always, thank you to my patrons for their continued support, and if you'd like to be a patron, it's only $1 a month for early access to every video, and exclusive Patreon-only reviews. So until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves, and embracing the inner ape.